In this lecture, I will show you how to create a table in a schema. There are two ways to create a table. One is going over to schema, browsing to tables, and right-clicking on tables. That will open up the options to create the table. And the second option is to write a SQL script. We will look at both these options. So let's dive in. Let's look into creating table by right-clicking. Go over to your schema, Sakila in this case, and click on the arrow next to it to expand to see what objects are within it. So you'll see table, views, stored procedure, and functions. We are going to be creating a table. So go ahead and right click on table. You will come up with the context menu that contains two options to create tables. Create table and create table like. Create table like uses predefined templates that you can use to create tables. If you are going to be creating a lot of tables, then you should create a template that you can use as a starting point. We are going to look into create table, which is starting from scratch. So go ahead and click on create table. It opens up a visual interface to create a table. In this interface, you will define everything you need to create a table. First is giving your table a name. So go ahead and give your table a name. I'll call it my table. You should give your table a name that describes the type of data it's going to store. So if it's going to store in student information, you should call it student or student info, etc. Next is the schema. That's where you're creating your table in. Collation is set of rules that define how to compare and sort character strings. So go ahead and leave this as default, which is the schema default. And then engine is just the backend storage engine for MySQL. InnoDB is the default. Leave it as it is. Comments are something that are related to that table, so which tells other people what they're looking or what kind of table it is. So you can call it my test table. Then you have column, data types, and bunch of predefined options. We'll go over those in a minute. So first is the column name. In order to start entering the columns, you start with column name. You can enter column name right underneath the column name heading. Alternatively, you can also double click that row and you will get a default column. So let's go ahead and double click it. Double clicking the column will give you first column as ID column, ID my table. And it's a data type of integer. Basically, every table needs some kind of identifier for the record. Each record in a table needs an identifier. Generally, that is of type integer, and that's what MySQL recognizes and creates one. Rather than calling the column name as ID my table, we are just going to call it ID. Leave it as data type integer. There are various data types available in MySQL. Integer is just a number, integer. Varchar keeps the characters, A, B, C, D, etc. Decimal is, as you know, it's a decimal number. Date, time, and block. Those are the main ones that you will end up using most of the time. We will leave this as data type of integer. Next column is PK. PK stands for primary key. Primary key is the identifier for that row in the table. If any other table is referring to this table, then this is the ID they will use to identify the record. Second column over is not null, which simply means is, do you allow null values to be stored for this column? By checking this box, you're telling the database that you do not allow nulls in this column. Since this is a primary key, you cannot have it as a null value, hence this column is checked. The next value is unique index. By checking this box, you are specifying that this column is part of the unique index. You will have to check unique index box for each of the columns that make up that unique index. B just stands for, is this a binary column? Binary means 0 or 1 value. Unsigned data type basically means that you cannot have negative values in this column. ZF stands for fill up the numeric values with 0 if it's empty. AI is auto incremental, which means we want this column to be automatically incremented. That means we do not have to enter a value. It'll just pick the last ID and then increment it by 1. G is a generated column, which means it's a column that pre-calculates the value based on an expression that you will enter right here. This column has default values or the expression that is used for calculating the generated value. We'll look at these as we are going through. So since this column is an ID of type int, we are going to use an auto increment. Go ahead and click it. You'll see same column specifications are repeated here as well. You can also enter comments for that column if you would like. So we're going to add now a few more columns. So go ahead and click underneath ID to enter a new column. By default, it fills in my table column, varchar, which is the character type, and everything else is blank. Let's call this column student name and then do the varchar as 100. We want to be able to store 100 characters in this field. It's not a primary key. We can leave it as null. So even if the student name is missing, that's fine. They have an ID assigned to them. So we'll leave it as this is. Next, double click again. Let's enter another one called score. And we will call it a data type of int. Another one called score2, data type int again. Another one called final score, data type int again. And then added date as your column type date time. If you enter a column by mistake, you can right click and do delete selected. Make sure the whole row is selected, else you will be deleting just the value in that particular column. So delete selected, we're done. Now I'm going to show you how to create these default values and expressions. So for added date, I would like to have it the current timestamp. In order to do so, go ahead and hover over this row, that added date, and right click, and you'll see some options here. Default is current timestamp. So let's go ahead and use it. You got the current timestamp as the value for added date. So you do not have to enter a value for added date when you're inserting a record. Now I'm going to also show you to use a default expression for generated value. So we'll call final score as your generated value. Go ahead and click it. Now you need to enter an expression here to calculate the value that will be stored in this particular column, final score in this example. In the expression column, you can use one or multiple columns and perform some kind of computation on them to come up with the value that will be stored or calculated for this column, the generated column. So for our example, we are going to perform a simple computation. These are the two columns. We're going to use these two scores and calculate a value that will be stored in final score. There are two ways to store this value. There is a virtual and stored. Virtual means it's calculated on the fly. When you select virtual, you're telling the database to calculate this value on the fly when it's selected, or you can choose to store it in the database as a physical value. So now you've got an expression, a default value, data type of int, varchar, and date time. So now your table is ready to be created. There's one thing I want to touch before we go is an index. Indexes help in finding the records quickly. So whenever a column is selected as a primary column, an index gets built as a primary index on that. So that's why you'll see it. You can name a primary index, whatever you want. And when you click on it, you'll see which column is selected for this indexing. We'll leave the defaults as it is. Go ahead and click on apply. And you will see there is a SQL statement gets created. That is your second way of creating a table. So MySQL interface is actually taking all your visually created table and generating a SQL for you. If you are very familiar with SQL, you can go ahead and write the SQL and it will generate the table for you. So let's go over this SQL so that you understand what's going on here. We're creating a table called my table. There are few columns in it, ID, which is int. We do not allow any null values, so it's not null. And then it's an auto increment. Second column is student name, varchar 100, we allow null. Score int, we allow null. Score2 int, we allow null. Final score is an auto generated, so it's an int, it's a generated always as score1 plus score2, and it's stored virtually, but having a virtual one saves you storage in the database. And then there is added date, date time, allows null. The default is current timestamp. So if you set a default value as current timestamp, it'll never be null actually. And then you have a primary key, which is ID. You've got your comment. Go ahead and apply it. If you run into any error, you will be prompted. You will be shown that error in MySQL. So let's go ahead and read this error. This error says unknown column score1 in generated column function. right? So let's go ahead and take a look if that's the case. You back out, you cancel it, and say, oh, our column is actually called score, not score 1. So we need to change the value of the column. So go ahead and change the score. If you know the mistake and you can correct, you can even apply that in the SQL and then we'll take care of it. So go ahead and apply now and apply again. Now, as you can see, SQL script was successfully applied to the database. You can click finish, go back to the list of tables in MySQL, expand it, and you will see my table is right here with the columns that we created. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to touch on this again. The second way of creating the table is by writing a SQL statement. You can go ahead and type create table statement and execute it to create your table. This is the same SQL that was created by the visual interface of MySQL Workbench. Both the ways work. Whichever way you are comfortable with, you can go ahead and start using that.